They thought they could break him. A homeowners association so obsessed with control, they turned a quiet neighborhood into a war zone of petty fines and threats. At first, it seemed like just another case of a resident refusing to follow the rules. But what the HOA didn't know was that the man they targeted wasn't just any homeowner. Behind his calm silence was a storm waiting to be unleashed. And when he finally revealed who he really was, the entire board's world came crashing down. So what happens when the HOA pushes the wrong man too far? Smith Johnson never wanted trouble. To him, home was a refuge, 4 walls, a small backyard where his dog could run, a quiet street where he could finally unwind after years of high-pressure work. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first glance. Well-kept lawns, rows of identical mailboxes, and neighbors who waved politely as they passed. But beneath the manicured hedges and smiling facades, something darker lingered. The HOA board. Everyone knew about them. They ran the neighborhood with an iron fist, sending violation letters for the smallest details, a trash can left out an hour too long, a garden gnome in the wrong place, or a car parked slightly outside the designated line. Most people grumbled but paid the fines anyway, too afraid of escalating the conflict. Smith thought he could keep his head down. After all, he worked long hours. He wasn't interested in community politics or pointless power struggles. He had moved here for peace, not arguments. For a while, it seemed fine. He mowed his lawn regularly, kept his house painted within the approved color scheme, and followed the guidelines to the letter. Yet, it didn't take long for the notices to begin. First, it was his trash bin. Then, the length of his grass, barely half an inch taller than the approved standard. Then, his dog barking for a few minutes in the evening, labeled a nuisance to the community. Each letter grew more aggressive, threatening fines, liens, even possible foreclosure if he didn't comply. At first, Smith ignored them, thinking it was just another round of overzealous rule enforcement, but the letters kept coming. And with them, the quiet stares from neighbors who whispered but said nothing out loud. There was something about the board's behavior that felt personal. The president, in particular, seemed to have singled Smith out. She showed up at his property unannounced, snapping photos of his backyard, demanding access to areas she had no authority over. Her words dripped with condescension as though she enjoyed the intimidation. Smith remained calm, polite even, never giving them a reason to escalate further. But behind his quiet demeanor he was already watching, already recording, already preparing. Because Smith wasn't just another homeowner. He was something far more dangerous to people who abused their power. And when the HOA pushed too far, they were about to find out exactly who they had been messing with. The escalation began with a letter so absurd Smith almost laughed. Violation, unauthorized flower planting. The board claimed his choice of roses clashed with the community's visual harmony. Along with the notice came a $500 fine and a demand that he remove the flowers within 14 days. It wasn't about flowers. It was about control. Smith had seen enough. But instead of reacting, he quietly documented every notice, every interaction, and every word. He created a folder, digital and physical, recording each moment with meticulous detail. Dates, times, photographs, even audio recordings of board members making thinly veiled threats. The harassment grew bolder. They fined him for having his car too dusty. They threatened him with legal action for leaving a garden hose in view. A board member even followed him one evening, snapping photos of his license plate as if to catch him breaking some unwritten rule. Neighbors whispered apologies when they saw him, but few dared to step forward. They had families, mortgage, lives too fragile to risk crossing the board. The HOA thrived on that fear, on the silence it created. But Smith wasn't afraid. He'd faced far worse than suburban bullies with clipboards. Then came the tipping point. One evening, Smith returned home to find an official letter taped to his door. This time, it wasn't just a fine. It was a foreclosure notice. The board claimed his unpaid violations had accumulated to the point where they were, initiating proceedings to seize his property. It was a lie. Smith had paid every legitimate fee, every due. But the board had forged documents, manipulated records, and built a case designed to break him. They thought he would panic. They thought he would fold. Instead, Smith smiled, because this was exactly what he had been waiting for. He attended the next HOA meeting, a gathering usually empty except for the board and a handful of residents. But this time the room buzzed. Word of the foreclosure notice had spread, and people wanted to see what would happen. The president sat at the front, smug and confident. She launched into her usual speech about protecting the community's values and upholding standards. Then she turned to Smith. "We have a homeowner here who has consistently refused to follow our rules," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "His violations are numerous, his fines unpaid. His property at risk? We cannot allow one individual to jeopardize our harmony." The room was silent. All eyes turned to Smith. He rose slowly, calm and deliberate, a thick folder in his hand. And that's when everything began to unravel. Smith walked to the front of the room. His presence was steady, controlled. He placed the folder on the table, the sound echoing louder than it should have. Then he began. "Every letter you've sent me," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "is in this folder. Every fine, every notice, every so-called violation. Documented, photographed, and recorded." He opened the folder, pulling out pages of evidence. Photos of his overgrown grass that was perfectly trimmed. Audio recordings of board members threatening him. Receipts proving every fee had been paid. Murmurs spread through the room. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening as the truth unfolded. "And this," Smith continued, pulling out a final envelope, "is the foreclosure notice you taped to my door? A forged document? A fraud." The president tried to interject, her voice sharp and defensive. "That's enough." But Smith wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, metallic, and undeniable. He placed it on the table. "A badge?" "I'm Smith Johnson," he said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The room froze. Gasps filled the air. "I've been investigating this board for months," Smith continued, his voice unwavering. "The harassment, the intimidation, the financial manipulation. It ends tonight." The president's face drained of color. She stammered, tried to regain control, but the weight of the truth was crushing. The neighbors, once silent, erupted in whispers, some pulling out their phones to record the moment. "This isn't about grass length or flower colors," Smith said, his tone sharp. "This is about abuse of power. And I promise you, justice is coming." The room was electric, years of fear shattered in an instant. For the first time, the community saw the board not as untouchable rulers, but as exposed bullies standing on shaky ground. Smith closed the folder, his final words ringing like a gavel. "This ends tonight," and with that the climax was sealed. The board's empire of fear had fallen. The silence that followed Smith's reveal lingered long after that chaotic HOA meeting. For years, the board had operated unchecked, issuing arbitrary fines, threatening foreclosures, and intimidating neighbors into compliance. But with one moment of truth, their carefully constructed empire began to unravel. In the days that followed, neighbors who had once kept their heads down started knocking on Smith's door. Stories poured out, unfair fines for garden decorations, threats over mailbox colors, warnings for children's toys left in driveways. Each tale carried the same thread: the board had weaponized its authority. For the first time, residents felt emboldened. Smith's revelation hadn't just shocked the board, it had empowered the entire community. 2 board members resigned within a week. Videos of the meeting spread across social media, shared by neighbors who had recorded the confrontation. HOA gets schooled by FBI agent became a headline that traveled far beyond the subdivision. The president refused to step down. She claimed the board had only been following the rules. But county officials, tipped off by Smith, began reviewing the HOA's finances. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators: misuse of funds, inflated violation notices, even illegal foreclosure threats. The board was forced into an emergency election. For years, attendance at HOA meetings had been dismal. Now the clubhouse was standing room only. Neighbors who had never cared about HOA politics lined up to vote. The old guard was swept out almost entirely. Civil suits followed. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined banded together, filing a class action lawsuit against the old board. With Smith's documentation, their case was airtight. Settlements reached into the tens of thousands. The president herself faced charges. Federal investigators uncovered discrepancies that hinted at embezzlement. Her pristine reputation crumbled under the weight of indictments. The neighborhood healed, the petty fines stopped, the aggressive letters ceased. For the first time in years, the subdivision felt like a home again. And Smith? He didn't gloat, he didn't run for office. He simply lived his life, walking his dog without fear, grilling on his patio, enjoying the peace he had fought for. But the story didn't end there. Word of Smith's confrontation spread online, becoming a rallying cry for those trapped in similar battles. His story inspired countless others to document their disputes and push back against abusive boards. One line from his speech echoed everywhere: "This ends tonight." Other HOAs in the county took notice. Homeowners began asking questions, requesting records, and showing up to meetings. What had started as one man's personal battle had grown into a movement for accountability. For Smith, the true victory wasn't the downfall of the HOA. It was the restoration of dignity. He had given his community its voice back. Months later, an elderly neighbor thanked him, not for exposing corruption, but for giving the neighborhood its freedom again. Smith only smiled. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. We just needed a push." And with that, he walked back into his home, closing the door behind him. The HOA had thought they could break him. Instead, they had ignited a revolution. So the next time someone tells you that you can't fight back, remember Smith, remember the folder of evidence, the badge on the table, and the words that changed everything. This ends tonight.